The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. And welcome to the .NET Core Podcast, an award-winning podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and, with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform, multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie Gabrokman-Taylor. In this episode, I talked with Carl Sargunar about what a .NET developer actually is. The .NET stack has actually changed quite a lot in recent years, and it now requires a new set of skills and expertise. Or does it? Carl and I chatted about how with the creation of things like Docker, you can abstract away most of the difficult parts in getting orchestrated and set up to create reproducible builds and even have truly cross-platform code. Something that Carl writes on his 64-bit Intel-based Windows machine can be copied over to my M2-based Mac Air and run with almost no changes because of things like Docker. All thanks to the wonderful worlds of open source, containers, and orchestration. But you don't even need to know what these things are. Carl and I talked about how you can get started using containers with almost no effort and without having to use the dreaded command line interface, making you effective and productive from the off. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So Carl, it's fantastic to be connected with you today. We've met in person a few times, and it's brilliant to finally have you on the show. It's been a while.
Yeah,
but,
appreciate it.
Things happen, right?
Calendar conflicts have gotten in the way, but I do appreciate finally being able to find a window that both of us can make. And I'm great. I'm very grateful to be on the show. Thank you, Jamie.
Oh, well, thank you, Carl. I will just say that life gets in the way.
It does.
Or as the great philosopher Dr. Ian Malcolm said, life finds a way, because it does, right? And that's what we do.
We just watched that last week with the kids, and it was a big thing because I've been wanting to show the kids Jurassic Park for such a long time, and they are just about old enough to actually appreciate it, and they watched it for the first time, and they weren't scared at all. Whereas when I watched it at their age, I was terrified. So.
Oh my goodness! Yes, I fully appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah,
I am still to this day, and I'm saying this publicly. I don't care if people are going to make fun of me, but I am terrified of dinosaurs, especially the ones with the big teeth. Right? They died 65 million years ago, and I can't do it. I can't go into museums. I can't go to prosthetic shows or whatever you call them, where they have the animatronics and stuff. I just can't do it.
It's the power of storytelling, isn't it? Like, doesn't matter how janky the special effects were, the power of storytelling with a really good story and the way it's presented just really gets to you.
Absolutely. Still related to, it's Steven Spielberg, right? So I don't think he's ever actually made a bad film. But related to that, I've seen some wonderful behind the scenes footage of the full-sized animatronic T-Rex that they built. And you know the big scene with it where it trashes the car and it screams out. It's nighttime and it's raining. Well, I don't know whether you know this, but the rain caused the servos in it to malfunction, and it shivers.
Wow.
So the behind the scenes footage, it's there. It's not real, but it's shivering like it's cold.
Dinosaur is cold. Oh wow, yeah. No, that's some fourth wall kind of uncanny valley stuff happening over there.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't come here to talk about a Jurassic Park, but I could talk about that movie.
Movies generally, I'm besides being a developer, I'm also a massive movie fan, and movies. I think again, it's back. Sorry, just to take it back to movies. It's about the storytelling for me. I absolutely love them. I'm not as big a fan of series. I mean, they're great. I'll watch a series and enjoy it, but a movie is something completely different. It's that whole experience and things. So yeah, I can talk about movies all day. So we can talk about movies if you'd rather, but I think your audience might appreciate development a bit more.
Of course, of course. But that's that. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Maybe. You see, I'm creating more work for myself. Maybe I need to start a movie discussion podcast,
Oh,
and we can just
I
talk
would
about
I
movies
would
all
be there in a flash for that.
day. Oh my goodness. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about when we were discussing this,
Mhm.
and I just want to set this and level set for people, is that before we get on to the topic, I just want to quickly discuss why we came up with this topic, and that's we were saying in the like pre-recording session that we did that .NET has sort of exploded over the last few years, and it used to be that a serious .NET developer would be Windows only, and they
Yeah.
would use Windows on their Windows machines to do Windows stuff.
Yes.
And that's no longer the case. So
No.
just wanted to sort of level set for the people who are listening in, because obviously there are. Before we get on to the topic, we'll properly introduce you in a moment, Carl.
Hmm.
There are people doing .NET now who never lived in that world. So, for those people, we're about to go down memory lane, I think, and just explain to you how it used to be. And maybe
Yeah.
to the people who
Absolutely.
haven't made that jump yet or don't see a need to make that jump yet, we'll maybe introduce some topics that they can maybe go away and learn a little bit more on their own time using Google, Bing, whatever search engine they
Yeah,
want, right?
absolutely. I mean, I hope that's a bit for everyone out there. I've been a developer for a long time, and I'm sure we'll cover this in due course. But yeah, this topic is a particularly close one to my heart because, yeah, it's just if you look outside of the kind of the sphere of .NET development, there is so much other development happening out there, and it felt for a long time like .NET was this kind of massive enterprise, slow moving, archaic kind of tanker that doesn't change often. It's the same thing over and over again. It's not responsive or reactive or agile, and that really isn't the world that we live in today anymore, and hasn't been for a long time. So yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about you, Cole. Well, let's do a brief introduction to you. Maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and then we know who Carl is. Who's this guy talking at me?
Absolutely. I'm Carl. Yeah, I've been a developer since I graduated from university. Actually, that's not strictly true. I've been a developer since I got given a computer when I was in my kind of early teens by my dad, and he brought a computer home from work one day, and I kind of see that as my start of my journey. So I've been a developer for a long time, but I've been doing it professionally since about 2004. So getting on for 20 years professionally now. I've been at this game a while. These days, I am predominantly a web developer. I do a lot of work with a particular content management system called Umbraco, but I also do kind of straight up web work. But I've been freelancing for a few years now, pushing on for 9 years, actually. Gosh, that's flown by. And I also do kind of other stuff with clouds and app development and Xamarin, and now Maui coming into things, which is their newest app development framework. So yeah, I just kind of, as a freelancer, as a fellow freelancer, I hope, I'm sure you appreciate, we tend to do what needs to be done. And I've always really enjoyed that challenge of just jumping into problems and helping people solve problems. So that's who I am. I'm a kind of freelance for hire who will come and help you solve your problems, and have been doing that for many, many years now.
Yeah, 100%. I totally understand and appreciate that. I've been doing it myself freelance for a while now, and yeah, you pick things up very quickly. I wouldn't say I'm wary of saying quicker than permanent people, but I guess because we've given more freedom,
Yeah,
to pick things up, then we have maybe again, maybe drive is not the right word, but we have this requirement to pick things up a little faster than learning it on the job. And there's nothing wrong with either side of it. Just
no, absolutely.
it's one of those skills you need to pick up, right, to be able to learn things very quickly.
Yeah, I personally, I think that this may just be something that, if your character is suited towards it, then it's the kind of thing that you really enjoy. And if your character isn't suited towards it, that's fine. There are plenty of kind of jobs out there that will suit you. You find the right thing that works for you. This just happens to be the thing that works for me. There's nothing wrong with what I do, nothing wrong with what other people do. You do the thing that works for you. So. But yeah,
Absolutely.
at the same time, yes, the number of projects I've been thrown in where I've no idea what the framework they've used in, and you go, okay, I'm fine. Let's just try to go back to basics, and let's try and solve this from early principles, and let's try and kind of understand what the problem is over here. And you draw on your experience, you draw on things that you've tried before and things that worked before, and hopefully get to a happy solution. Not always, but that's the way it rolls.
Absolutely, and I feel like that, I suppose, comes into what we're going to be talking about, and that is, you and I were talking a while back about what is a .NET developer, right? Because it means a whole bunch of different things to different people. Traditionally, like if we go back 10, 15 years ago, a .NET developer would be someone who uses .NET framework on Windows, maybe some jQuery if you're lucky.
Yeah, they never liked the web stuff in the early days. It was always kind of play with it at arm's length as opposed to actually embracing it fully. It's certainly in my personal experience, anyway. So no, I've spent many years in my career. In my early career especially, sat in a room with 20 other developers, all of us on identical Windows machines, all of us using MSDN licenses to look things up, days before Stack Overflow, focusing only on Windows. Web was something that we did and moved slowly into, but even then it was a lot of the web stuff was done the Microsoft way, and I think that old legacy of just doing things the Microsoft way, just doing things the .NET framework way, just doing things the way that was prescribed, might color a lot of people's opinions about what .NET still is. Because that's what .NET was back in the day. But these days, it is a very, very different kettle of fish. It's a very, very different landscape. The framework is completely different. For anyone who doesn't know and has been under a rock for the last 4 or 5 years, .NET now runs on any operating system. It'll run anywhere. It'll run on Macs, Linuxes, ARM, any architecture. It'll run on ARM. It'll run on Raspberry Pis. It'll run on IoT devices. There's a .NET framework that'll run on ESP32s, microcontrollers and things like that. So .NET really is embracing so much out there, and it's a very, very different landscape from what that traditional Windows focused, building Windows apps and deploying them through setup programs that you downloaded and installed kind of thing. That world is a very different world.
Absolutely. And I think it was you and I were discussing a talk that you gave last year. So in 2022, we were discussing a talk that you gave at Code Garden and DDD Southwest.
Yeah.
I believe the talk was called Docker is a Gateway Drug, .NET Everywhere.
Yes, that talk came about from when I mentioned earlier that I work a lot with the Umbraco content management system. For a long time, that was written on framework that only ran on Windows machines. But when .NET 3.1 launched, that was the first version that Umbraco kind of embraced, and they basically took on a full platform rewrite to migrate the entire code base from framework to 3.1. And early alphas came out when .NET Core was released, back when your show was in fact, what kind of attracted me to start listening to your show, because that was the kind of time that I think you were kind of just kind of getting going. And it being able to run the CMS that I'd been developing with for the last kind of 5 years on a Raspberry Pi kind of just flicked a switch in my head going, wow, this is really, really cool. What else can I do? Where else can I run this? And being able to run it on a Linux machine and a virtual machine and Hyper-V on my own host, that was completely mind-blowing. So from there I went, okay, well, if I can run it on that, there are these things called containers that everyone is talking about. Can I run it on there? And obviously, yes, I could. So, I started experimenting. I started playing. I created my own little kind of mini cluster of Raspberry Pis at home and was able to run 3 different hosts, all running Docker, all running this content management system, all running SQL Server for Azure SQL Azure Edge, which is a version of SQL which runs on ARM, and run this entire system on a Raspberry Pi in a container on Linux, and it was super performant, and it was really very, very different to the entire experience I had before, which was great. And since then, I've kind of just wanted to kind of shout about it. So I've done, as I say, the talk at Code Garden, which was the conference for Umbraco. I did a talk there. I did a talk at DDD Southwest, which is a Bristol-based .NET talk, which happened last June and is happening again. Actually, by the time this podcast goes out, it might have already happened. But it happens in the summer every time, and I've done it at 3 or 4 other conferences and meetups. And I've just kind of become an evangelist for talking about containers and running .NET code and other places. So it's all very exciting stuff.
It really is. It really is. It's the last few years have been a wonderful time to be a .NET developer because quite literally you can do your development anywhere. Like we were discussing just before we went live, I'm sitting at a Mac Air with an M2 chip. That's a brand new CPU architecture. Admittedly, the M1 was brand new, but this is an ARM chip that is a brand new CPU. It's not Intel based. It's not x86 based. It's not a Ryzen super duper GTI whatever, right? You can tell I'm a hardware head, right? But it's none of those things. And yet the day I bought it, got it home, opened it up, installed the .NET toolkit, and I could just run the .NET apps, right? That's a brand new architecture that's less than 18 months old.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can run .NET on it, right? And that's mad to me.
That was exactly the same feeling that I had when I launched that, when I kind of got that first Raspberry Pi up and SSH'd onto it and terminal connected it on terminal, ran a script that I downloaded from Microsoft's site, and then was able to do .NET New and then fire up a web project and then .NET Run and run it and see it and open up the port on my network and connect to it from my desktop computer across my home network to run an MVC site on a little tiny ARM system that cost 35 quid. And I did some load testing and it was blazing fast. So this was a very different, very new and exciting world. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, to the extent that a lot of .NET developers now are no longer using Windows as their main machine. I know you're amongst their number too, and I still do a lot of legacy development, so I still need to keep my Windows machine. But I also have I also dual boot to Linux. I don't need to run Windows for my day-to-day work anymore. I can run Linux, and I also have a Mac machine myself. So I do. I can pick the tool that I feel like using for that particular day, and I'm not restricted anymore. The whole choice is available to us.
Absolutely, and that's the great thing about this. There's something that Scott Hanselman says, and he said it specifically about some of the CLI tooling about a year or a year and a half ago. There's a video that he put out where he's jumping around in the tooling and he goes, here's Windows Terminal. I'm doing .NET in here.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to jump to Notepad. Now I'm going to jump to Vim.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to jump to Emacs. Now I'm going to jump to Visual Studio. And he turned to the camera and says, use what makes you happy.
Yeah.
And I love that that is now the target of use whatever makes you happy. And to the point that you raised there about a lot of .NET devs don't actually run Windows anymore, it may actually surprise some people that listen into this. And it will definitely surprise some .NET people who haven't been exposed to .NET Core and then as it's been renamed .NET yet. A lot of the devs that I've spoken to on a personal basis at Microsoft don't actually run Windows because they don't need to anymore.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I can remember when I got when I first saw a conference. I can't remember which conference it was, but there was a Microsoft conference when .NET Core was just being announced, and the speaker came up on stage, and he had a MacBook, and that was like, wow, there's someone at a Microsoft conference, one of their primary main conference. It was David Fowler, I think, who did it. David Fowler works on the framework himself, and yeah, he came up on stage with a MacBook, and that was like, wow, such a moment for me. So yeah, and I think to come back, loop back to kind of your earlier point, a lot of developers may not know that from the .NET side of things, and I think there are a lot of developers out there who know very little about .NET, who still kind of hold on to that slightly older an opinion that .NET is only Windows and .NET is only one framework that runs and does one job and nothing else. So it's not just the .NET developers who may not be kind of aware that now we are part of this global community that can run anywhere and do anything. But there might be other Go developers and PHP developers and Ruby on Rails developers who still kind of hold on to older ideas that .NET doesn't run in the same way that they can. Which is, hopefully that'll change over time, and the way we can help that change is by doing more cross-pollination between our various ecosystems. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. One of the things that I find when I talk to a lot of there's sort of three different camps, I feel, of .NET developers, and wherever you sit, and you don't have to just sit in one camp, wherever you sit in these camps is perfectly fine. I find that there are .NET people who are very excited. I don't want to say evangelists, but very, very excited, like you or I. Oh, cool! Look at this thing that I can do. Like I can run it on. I can run it on my Raspberry Pi. I can run it on a fridge. Yes. Pro tip for people who don't know: if you own Samsung hardware that has the Tizen logo on it, .NET is the officially supported programming platform for Tizen. So if you have a Tizen device, you can push your .NET app to that device, a fridge, a TV, whatever. So there's that side of things where people are very excited. They're terribly excited about what's happening. We want to tell everyone. There's people kind of in the middle who are, yeah, I know about the new .NETs, but I can't use it yet because the project that I work on doesn't allow me to. And there are there are another third set of developers who are very much a case of, I think you used the phrase head under a rock earlier on. And sometimes it is that, sometimes it's just, and we've talked about this on Tabs and Spaces, where it's like, if you are a 9-to-5 developer, you get in, you start developing at 9, you stop at 5, and you go home and do something else. Fantastic. That is perfectly fine. That you are a developer. I'm not a gatekeeper here. Or rather, I'm not trying to be a gatekeeper here. And what I find is traditionally the group of people that are in that third set and some of the people from the second set, so the people who maybe don't know that .NET has gone cross-platform, and the people who are, I love it, but I can't use it, they don't tend to know some of these things because they don't get exposed to it. And I feel like that it's perfectly okay for people not to know about this.
Absolutely. And 100%. This isn't a gatekeeping thing. I think this is one of those where the path is there ahead of you, and if you choose to walk that path, then fantastic. Come on in. The water's lovely. And one of the nicest things that I've been kind of talking about in my Docker and all my kind of conference talks is that tools like Docker really make it easy to make that leap. You don't need to install Linux on your you don't need to have an old machine. You don't need to have a Mac. You don't need to spend $2,000 to buy the latest shiny Apple hardware so that you can try this out yourself. You can download Docker for Windows right now on a up-to-date version of Windows 10 or Windows 11, and you can fire up your own container in Linux, running a MongoDB instance or a SQL instance on Linux, or a PHP server, or just a very basic Apache server, and run .NET code on there to try it yourself. You don't need to do a lot of setup. You don't need to spend money to do all this stuff. The barrier to entry to trying these new things has really, really reduced. It's just down to finding the right information, finding a tutorial you can follow, finding a YouTube video. There's plenty out there. I've got a few out there myself. There really is very little reason stopping people to kind of go out there and discover what .NET can do and what it can run. If you're in that third camp, if you've never been exposed to it and you're happy with it, or you've never had the opportunity professionally to kind of do .NET work on other platforms, and some of my day-to-day work does fall into that. Some of the projects that I support are very legacy platforms and very legacy systems. That is part of my work, but it does mean that I spend some of my own time playing around with Docker and Linux and this kind of thing, just to see what else is out there, see what other things that can be done. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like you said, you don't have to leap over, right? You can try it in a VM or with Docker on your machine, and that's what makes things like Docker wonderful. One of the things that I've actually found, right? So I remember the early days of .NET Framework, where if you installed more than one .NET framework,
oh yes, yes,
you'd run into trouble. Right?
and every time a new version of Visual Studio came out, and there was basically 6 months where you couldn't write any new code because you had to slowly migrate the old version off and the new version on. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that .NET and Docker combined and separately. So you don't have to do Docker stuff to do modern .NET, and you don't need to do modern .NET to do Docker. You can do them, they're mutually exclusive. But one of the things that they both allow you to do is you can install different versions of stuff and run different versions of stuff side by side.
Absolutely.
Which is wonderful, right? So like on this machine I'm talking to you now, I think I've got .NET 5, no, I think it's .NET 6 because .NET 5 wasn't supported by anyone. So .NET 6 and .NET 7. But on my desktop, I've got 2.1, 3.1, 5 point something, 6 point something, 7, and one of the latest version 8 RCs. And they're all installed locally on the entire machine. And I can create a JSON file in the root of my root of my source code or whatever that says, okay, .NET, I'm supposed to be using version 2. So if you've got that, run it in that, which is wonderful, right? So you don't even have to worry about those compatibility issues of running multiple things at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Just being able to know that you can run a global JSON in a project repository and just target a specific version. That's a really cool trick to know. And just knowing that despite you have how many versions of .NET you have running, you can just target one and not worry about it. That's it. Everything you do in that repository and below it will be in that one version. Is really, really cool.
It really is. And there's another trick, one that I learnt when I was messing around with Blazor during its sort of initial release. And that trick was I actually had Docker be my dev tools. So I had Docker installed, and that would have I'd have like the latest preview bits of Blazor. And when I wanted to build and run the app, I would issue the docker build docker run command. And because everything's running inside of Dockerland, it doesn't touch any of the files on my computer. So when it came time to actually delete that, it was just a case of, I'll just delete that Docker image.
God, that's absolutely, that isolation is fantastic. I can remember in the early days where I have had a virtual machine where I was basically dedicated for my dev work, and I would have a separate machine for my personal and web browsing and things like that, because I didn't want to risk anything to my dev machine, because any downtime there costs money, it costs time, it costs, the productivity, the resource that you're most, you're there to do a job, and you don't want to have anything that gets in the way of that. Whereas now the tools all just talk to each other so much better. You don't have to worry about having, I have production. I have the release versions of the IDE Visual Studio, as well as preview versions side by side of my machine. No problems at all. They all just kind of work together and talk together really well. And just kind of on that same point of talking together and working together really well, these containers, these tools, they open up a whole new opportunities out there. You don't necessarily need to know the the language that any project is written in to be able to be helpful and useful in that project. I could go and do something on Ruby on Rails. I know very little Ruby on Rails, but I could still write some .NET code, put it in a container that will, call it an API and do something and provide some service for a website that's run on Ruby on Rails. And that is code that will run absolutely fine side by side in its own container, talking to the Ruby on Rails project. We're no longer restricted to only working on .NET solutions and .NET projects as .NET developers. There is a whole, literally, the world is our oyster, or to coin Terry Pratchett, the world is our lobster. You can go out there and work on any project you want to, because now our tools will work alongside other tools quite easily, which is really, really exciting.
I have to say, I loved the Pratchett reference. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. It's got to be done.
If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? Check out Podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. You're absolutely right, and it also means that so I haven't had a huge amount of experience with this. I wonder if you have, but it doesn't matter if you don't, because there's actually a way of building and running your applications using, and to use the really old term, a dumb terminal or a low-powered machine, right? We're talking about, you talked earlier on about building and running on a Raspberry Pi, but I mean like building and running your multi-stack application on something that's low-powered, like a Chromebook or something. Because there are things like Mac in Cloud, Xamarin and .NET, .NET MAUI, but also there are products like GitHub's Codespaces and JetBrains Fleet that use containers in the on the other side that you don't see, where they essentially spin up an IDE in the cloud, so you don't even need a super duper powerful machine.
No, and this is another great thing about it, kind of lowering the barrier to entry. You can basically use the tools that you have available to you and still get access to really, really powerful compilers and runtimes. GitHub Codespaces, especially, where I think they recently announced at their last conference that they're making it free for everyone for a certain amount of time every month. I'm not sure how many hours it is, but you can basically log on right now, and as long as the project is configured to be able to take advantage of it, then you can fire up a code space, run run the library that you're working with in a Docker container on their server, and you can pause it. You could literally just freeze its status as it is, come back to it later, and pick it up and carry on where you were. And you don't need to run it on anything more complicated than whatever machine you have with you. You don't need to have those expensive tools, which is great for anyone. Anyone can now just pick these things up and run it. And it's not just individuals, it's great for teams as well, because you can then now also share those containers with other people. So you don't need to have that whole, well, it works on my machine, therefore you can't, if we can't get it working on your machine, you can't work on this project. I can fire up a container and anyone can jump into that and see it working there and just kind of carry on working with it and clone it and create copies of it. And they're just files at the end of the day.
Absolutely, 100%. I do remember a number of years ago, I was working on a brand new project, and it took me 3 days to get everything installed and configured.
Those memories, I absolutely. I've had most of my early jobs. The first week is getting your computer ready. Installing the various tools, and if you compiled the main repository by the end of that first week, you were doing well. And I've been in a position where I've been the person doing that, and I've been in a position where I've been hiring, and the people that I've hired have come in, and you spend the time with them, and it's a huge, massive drain of resource, of time, setting all these things up. Whereas now, you don't need any of that. It's been moving that way for a while, because you could get virtual machines on cloud hosted platforms for a while, but now with containers it's just that much easier, because the difference between a container and a traditional virtual machine is, with a virtual machine you not only have to what a virtual machine will essentially do is virtualize the hardware for you. You still need an operating system on top of it. You still need something to run your operating system, on top of which you build your platform, on top of which you run your code. So, in a Windows sense, you'd need to install Windows, you might need to install IIS, you might need to install SQL Server. But with containers, it's not virtualizing the hardware, it's actually virtualizing the operating system. So you don't need to replicate that. I can basically run on a very, very lightweight container my application, and the entire container might not be bigger than 60, 70 megabytes. And that would be all my code and everything it needs to run. And that, that reduction in resource requirement means that 10 people can use the same hardware, whereas previously it might be only 1 or 2, or 10 processors can use the same hardware. So it's really becoming very easy to do this kind of thing now.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also easy to share.
Yeah.
Because if you could do all of the things we're talking about with Docker and containers with a virtual machine image.
Yeah.
But the problem with a virtual machine image is it's a binary file that represents the same kind of thing. It's not exactly the same, but the same kind of thing. Where it's like it's the operating system and all the libraries installed and all of the packages and all of the tools and stuff. But it's a one massive multi-gigabyte binary file, so you can't easily share that. And you can't track the changes either. So if someone installs, grabs the image, installs something else, then saves over that image, that's now changed forever. Whereas Docker files, the files that Docker uses are just plain text, and they describe the changes.
Absolutely. And you can see, you keep them in your source control in exactly the same way that you keep your code in control. So you're describing your environment, you're describing the tools that you're using, you're describing the versions of the libraries that you need, you're describing your configuration, and any changes, you can just view the history. You can go and see what changes were made to get to any of that, which, makes troubleshooting so much easier. Yeah, exactly. It's so nice to be able to do this kind of thing now, and still developing stuff the traditional way is great, but it does feel a little bit kind of clunky almost when you have to work on a legacy project, which I do from time to time still today. But even when I work on a legacy project, what I try and do is move the things that I can off onto containers. For example, I run multiple versions of SQL Server in containers because certain projects need specific versions of SQL Server, and I can have a container that I only spin up for a specific project. And when I'm not working on this project, I just turn the container off. That resource is no, that those system resources are not being used when I'm not using that project, which means traditionally where I might have had on my main machine, I might have had SQL Server installed, and I might have 30 databases for the various projects that I've worked on. I now don't need that. I can just have 30 different containers, but I only spin up the ones that I need, and when I don't need them, turn them off. They just sat there as files on the file system now.
Mm-hmm. And that's what's great about these things, because, hard drive space is cheap, right?
Yeah.
And just having the files on your hard drive space, just sitting there not being used, is infinitely cheaper and better for the environment, I think, than having a dedicated server or a VM sitting somewhere constantly running on the off chance that something will hit it with some kind of request.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. These large machines that are used in servers, they take resources just to run. They take electricity, and they run several hundred watts even in idle, doing nothing. So that cumulatively, that all adds up. If you think about a company with a reasonable number of developers, to host a virtual machine to serve that many developers, 50, 60 developers maybe, would take quite a lot of power. Whereas if you all just had containers running on your local machines, or even containers running on hosts, if you're not using them, just put them to sleep. Put them to a kind of hibernated state and save the files, and it's a lot better.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a whole bunch about Docker and its containers, right?
Yeah.
We did say earlier on, but just in case people missed it, I don't have to use Docker, right?
No, Docker is just the kind of the Hoover of the container world. There are many containers out there, and there's an open container standard as well, of which Docker containers kind of are a part of them. But yeah, there are a whole other kind of other types of containers out there. I mean, Docker wasn't even the first. Containers have been around since long before Docker. I don't know my container history as well as I'd like to, but I remember reading about kind of very early concepts of containers running in early versions of Linux as completely standalone, isolated processes, which basically could then be spun up and shut down in very similar ways that containers are kind of isolated from each other. They have their own space, their own storage, their own kind of file systems, and that's there are a lot of concepts that you need to kind of think about when you start working with containers, but you don't need to know all of them from day one. And I think that's just to kind of move in a slightly different direction. If you read a lot about this stuff, it can be very daunting to think, wow, do I need to learn Linux? Do I need to learn about the Linux file system and how to work in command lines? Yeah, that kind of stuff is helpful to know, but you don't need to know that stuff from day one. The Windows Docker desktop application is a GUI application. You can use the GUI to just run containers inside there, run test applications inside there. Absolutely, learning more about the Linux file system and Linux commands and how to navigate the file system is helpful, but you will naturally pick that stuff up anyway. I knew very little about this when I started experimenting with Raspberry Pis couple of years ago, whereas now, just through kind of playing with them in my own spare time, you learn a lot about the stuff just by being immersed in it and playing around with it and trying new things and failing a lot. The number of times that you try and learn something and you spend the whole evening scratching your head going, this isn't working, I don't understand why it's not working, and then more often than not, you come back to the problem a couple of days later, and oh yeah, no, that was it. Uh, the biggest one is usually for me. I've got the wrong line endings on my files because I've been working on my files in Windows, and Windows has the carriage return line feed line ending, whereas Linux files only use line feed as their line endings, and that kind of thing can that can throw you if you're not immersed in this stuff every day. But playing around with it kind of helps you get over that barrier.
Mm-hmm. And the thing with the especially the line endings thing, usually that's not a huge problem because what's interesting is Microsoft took the initiative to fix. Hopefully, you can hear the bunny quotes there. To fix line endings on Windows and with Notepad and things like that.
Yeah.
And regardless of where you fit on that spectrum of should it be CRLF, carriage return line feed, or should it just be line feed, having files that don't suddenly become invalid when you move across OSs is quite nice.
Absolutely. I mean, back in the early days, that was a big problem. It's much less of an issue now. But yeah, when I first started kind of working around with this stuff, it threw me quite a lot. So, but now, the tools that there are a lot of editors out there you can use. People use whatever editor you're comfortable with. But personally, I think Visual Studio Code is one of the nicest editors and IDEs. It's not really, I wouldn't call it a full IDE. It's not a Visual Studio kind of heavyweight development environment. It is an editor, but it's so powerful, and there are so many fantastic extensions for it. Wherever you fall on your tools of choice, whether you like to use Notepad or whether you like to use full Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, there are a lot of tools out there that you can use. That those are just the ones that I personally prefer. But I found that when you're working with files and when you're working on projects, Visual Studio is a really awesome IDE. It's a really heavyweight tool for working with this stuff, but there are so many other editors out there: Sublime, VS Code, Notepad, Notepad++. You use the tool that works for you. Personally, I think VS Code, Visual Studio Code, is one of the nicest code editors out there. It's not a full IDE like Visual Studio, but there are so many useful tools, extensions, that people have written to work with, with Docker, with containers, with Kubernetes, to be able to connect to SQL servers and MySQL servers and various services out there. So and that makes it easier. You can use the tool that that makes it easier. You can no.
Use what makes you happy?
Yeah. Okay. That makes it easier. You can use the tool that you feel comfortable with, which is really useful.
Yeah. I for a while I walked away from the Windows version of Visual Studio, right? Not Visual Studio Code, the cross-platform, but I mean the Windows version. And I came back to it for a project I worked on last year. And what I found was, and this will be, some people will be listening along going, that's super obvious. You can right-click on a project and say, hey, can you add a container to this? And it will do all of the wiring up for you. And then you can hit F5, run your app in the container, and hit a breakpoint and pause it and poke around. It's amazing.
Brilliant. I think, this is probably true of any development tool out there and any language. But if the developers who worked on this stuff, worked in .NET, 5-10 years ago, were able to see the tools that are just available freely. You don't need to pay to use Visual Studio. Even you don't need to pay to use VS Code. That's a free thing. But a lot of people might not know that Visual Studio is also available free for community use. And if your company is a small company, I think there's up to £1 million I'm not sure what the license requirements are for Visual Studio, but anyone who's learning it can certainly pick it up and use it for free. And you're not only restricted to those. I mean, JetBrains Rider is another fantastic IDE that a lot of people have picked up, and that's a paid one. That is one that you kind of have to pay a license fee for, but it works for a lot of people, and a lot of people swear by it. Personally, I tend to be just vanilla Visual Studio. I haven't yet gotten over the muscle memory, because Visual Studio is something that I've been working with for such a long time that I just know where everything is in Visual Studio, and I haven't quite made the switch over to be able to use JetBrains fully yet. But it's really good, and it's a fantastic tool.
Oh, totally. As an early adopter of JetBrains Rider, I can quite happily say to you that when you first install it, it says, do you want to use the Visual Studio key map, or do you want to use our key map?
Yeah.
So it makes it even easier.
Yeah.
That you can just go, oh, cool, I'm coming from Visual Studio. Pretend you're Visual Studio, please. And then all of your keyboard shortcuts still work.
Yeah. That's I mean, I have it installed right now. I'm looking at the icon on my machine. It's just probably for force of habit that every time I open up a project to work in, I just go into Visual Studio. What I probably need to do is just force myself to kind of cold turkey Visual Studio for a week and do nothing but JetBrains. Like, just make myself work in JetBrains for a period of time, and then it'll pick it up. I know that if you use ReSharper, especially, that JetBrains is a lot more performant than ReSharper on top of Visual Studio, because you're basically layering again, aren't you? You're layering one extension on top of the base IDE, whereas it's just built into JetBrains.
Yes. I will not say, because I said this before on an earlier episode of the podcast, and one of the people from the Visual Studio team got in touch and went, hey, that's no longer the case. I will not say that Visual Studio is single-threaded anymore, because it's not. But, a number of years ago, because, like you said, because if you install ReSharper on top of Visual Studio, ReSharper has to sit in that plugin architecture.
Yeah.
And that can slow it and Visual Studio down. But like you said, ReSharper is built into Rider. So if you're interested in doing that, it's already there, right?
It is.
And so if your company is big enough, or if your company fits outside of the community licensing for Visual Studio, then it may be worth looking into Rider. I think, because they do a 14-day trial, I think or is it a 7-day trial? I forget which one. Please double check and go on the website for JetBrains to check. But they do offer a free trial, and I feel like it's useful for developers to know that there are other tools available, even if they've never used them, because then it gives you that chance to actually step out and say, oh, well, I've heard of that, never used it, but I know that it exists, and I know that it's useful for this particular thing, right?
I mean, I guess this kind of also comes back full circle to the point we were talking about earlier, where it's not just one language that you have to work in anymore. It's not just one tool you have to work in anymore. And if you do happen to make the switch to use Rider, JetBrains also have tools and IDEs for a load of other languages out there, which are really, really kind of industry leading in a lot of them. So that'll be another reason to make it easier for us .NET developers to work with other platforms and other tools. You're no longer restricted to just using the same tools and the same platforms and the same languages. You choose the tool that you're comfortable with, and you choose the IDE, the developer tool that you're comfortable with, and you choose the one that's the right for the project that you're working on. And if you find you don't get on with one, go find another one. There are other ones out there.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, all you're doing is moving plain text around in text files.
Yes,
and
indeed.
So if you want to use Notepad or the equivalent on your computer, you can totally do that. That's not a problem. In fact, this is something I've brought up a few times. I can't remember whether it was on this show or Tabs and Spaces, but when I did my comp sci degree for Programming 101, my lecturer was the infamous Rob Miles. He's a wonderful chap. And he's a Microsoft MVP, pretty well known in certain circles of the .NET space. And what he used to do is he'd bring a laptop in, plug it into the overhead projector or whatever, and he'd bring up Notepad, and he'd be like, right, today we're going to write a file parser in Notepad.
Yeah.
And I remember asking him at one point, I know that Visual Studio exists because we use it in the labs, and I'm not trying to ask imperative why, but like, what's the thinking behind why you use Notepad and the C# compiler? If you've never used that from the command line, that's a trick. Yeah, CSC.
CSC, yes, absolutely. I remember using CSC in very, very early days of getting CI/CD working and trying to kind of get automatic compilation of committed code working with PowerShell scripts before this was such a ubiquitous thing. Sorry, carry on.
No, it's fine. And yeah, so I asked him, why are you doing specifically Notepad and the CSC exe instead of loading up Visual Studio? And he said, I feel that there's knowledge and power in being able to not use the tools if you don't need them. Yeah. And he said, I'm teaching you C#. I'm not teaching you Visual Studio. And he said, there's nothing wrong with the Visual Studio at all. It's just, this was the early 2000s. Yeah. Visual Studio was still really relatively new. If something broke in the middle of a lecture, you'd have to spend the next 40 minutes fixing it. Fixing the tools.
Finished, absolutely.
Yeah, right. The lecture's over. You haven't actually taken anything from it. Whereas Notepad is guaranteed to work.
I mean, just to kind of touch on that point about learning again, we learned .NET back in the day when a console application started with, a whole lot of using statements and namespaces and public static main and a whole lot of other stuff, whereas single line applications now with newer versions of .NET are a thing where you don't need any of that decoration. You don't need to learn what is a namespace and why do I have to have these curly brackets around my code? Why can't I just write the thing that I want to do? If all I want to write out is hello world, why do I have to put all this decoration around it? So the changes that have come along with newer versions of the framework are a huge step to bringing new developers into this ecosystem, because that's another kind of mental barrier that's no longer there, where you don't need to learn stuff that isn't relevant for the thing that you're trying to learn. You just need to if I just want to write out hello world onto the console application, I just write out hello world and bang, there it is, which is really cool.
Oh, absolutely. And it, like you said, it reduces that barrier to entry, which effectively gets rid of any gatekeepers that were there. I mean, I've never witnessed any, so I can't say whether there are gatekeepers or not. Yeah. But it gets rid of those gatekeepers who say, you need a super powerful computer, you need Visual Studio, which you have to pay for, by the way, and you need these tools, and you need this, and you need that. Yeah. And now that you've gotten all of those things, you can now start learning. Whereas actually, the learning part is the hard bit.
Yes.
If you've got, like I said with Rob Miles, if you've got a tool that only works sometimes or causes weird esoteric errors that you don't understand yet because you're not at that point in your journey with a programming language, then you're going to give up, right? I remember back at college, so I'd have been about 17 years old. So for the international audience, college in the UK is 16 to 17, and then you might go to university afterwards. I remember back at college, we were doing some C++ stuff. And in order to use the IDE that was chosen for this course, you had to drop out of Windows because it was a DOS 3.1.
Gosh, yeah.
And when things go wrong in DOS, they go wrong.
They go very, very wrong. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And to kind of to circle around to containers again, that's another great reason to use containers in your code where you can, because when you compile an image into containers, when you compile your code into an image, that is repeatable. That image is there, that process is the same, and wherever you run it, you're running the same code, you're running the same process. So you no longer have that, well, it'll work on this machine because this has the libraries installed. The image will already have everything that it needs to run. It will already have all the references to libraries. It will already have the services it needs baked right into it. So wherever you choose to run that, it just works. It just works.
Absolutely.
I really, I wish I get more opportunity to work with containers in my day-to-day work. I don't, unfortunately, but every opportunity outside of that I get, I take it because they're such a cool tool.
Absolutely. And the thing that I find wonderful about container work is you could build a container on your machine using a Docker file, right? And a Docker file, we've breezed over this, but it is quite literally just a list of plain text steps for Docker to do. Install this, install that.
Yeah.
Now pull this code. Now run this command.
Yeah.
And now serve the app, all right? It's not exactly that, but that's what it boils down to, right?
Essentially, absolutely.
You could build a Docker image on your machine, send me the Docker file, and as long as I have all of the source code that you are compiling and running with that Docker file, I can run it on my machine. And you're sitting behind a machine that is, you said yourself, you're dual booting Linux and Windows on x86, x64 hardware, Intel or AMD. You can send that file to me. I can run Docker run on that file, or Docker build then Docker run, on my Mac M2, and it runs exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the thing that I relied on. I mean, last year I ran a workshop at the Code Garden conference for Umbraco, where I introduced a whole load of people. We had about 70, 80 people turn up, both in person and online, who had never used containers before. And all together over the space of 2 hours, we cloned a repository down, we started a project, we created Docker files, and we were all able to basically get to the point where we were able to run this site on a container on our machines. But in the same repository, and it's on my GitHub. If anyone wants to find out the link, I'm happy to tweet it out later. But you can clone this down. There's also a completely finished repository there where you don't even need to do any of the actual kind of setup yourself. You just clone the repository, and you run something called Docker Compose, which basically will not just run one container, but Compose lets you kind of create an application with multiple containers, and it will spin up a web server, a database server, a small website that's running Blazor, and a small website that's running an API, and fire them all up. And you can just go Docker Compose up, it will build all of it, and it will run it for you, and then you can just open up a browser and run it, which is really, really cool.
It is. It's marvelous. But yeah, so gone are the days of, I remember, we've got this new app that we've built. We better talk to ops about them buying a server and finding, the budget to buy a server, and then getting them the budget to install the correct operating system with the right licenses, then installing the security systems, then setting up all of the network hardware to wire it all up so it sits nicely behind our firewall. And then maybe in 2 weeks' time, we're ready to deploy. And then we can point at the outside world and have a DNS entry pointing to that server where the app will eventually be running, right? Whereas, you were saying, you just do a Docker-compose space up, hit return, and it spins all of that infrastructure up on your machine.
It's really cool, and that's the biggest takeaway for me from this conversation. I know we've kind of rambled a little bit and moved from various points, but for me, it really is a gateway to learning and being able to do all this stuff anywhere. It's almost democratized being able to do development, because you don't need a huge amount of resources, you don't need a huge amount of tools, you don't need infrastructure. It just makes things accessible and easy, and there are so many projects out there that will help people learn this stuff, and so much documentation and instructional videos. So it's a really cool time to be a developer.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like you were saying earlier on, there will be parts of apps that you are working on where you may be able to strip parts out and put them inside of containers, which then kind of future-proofs them a little bit as well. Because you're, like you said, you're abstracting away the operating system, abstracting away the dependencies. You just have the source code and a text file that describes the perfect infrastructure for it to sit on.
Absolutely, it's a very basic things, but works so well, and it works in a repeatable fashion. It's great.
Excellent. Well, what I'll say, Carl, is thank you ever so much for talking with us. I know that outside of the recording, because our editor Mark does a wonderful job at this. Obviously, I've kept you for way too long, and you've got people saying, "Hey, Carl, why don't you come check this out?" So, what I will say, Carl, is thank you ever so much for talking with us and putting up with me for sure.
Thank you for taking the time to have me on the show. It's been a really, really fun conversation. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this stuff to anyone. So, if you ever find me in the real world or on social media, just if you ever want to chat about containers and stuff, I'm always happy to do so. And also apologies to your editor, because I know that we've had a few interruptions throughout this recording.
Hey, that's fine. It's okay. Those things happen, right? Just quickly before we sign off then, Carl, where can people go to find out more about you? I mean, I know that we initially got connected on Twitter. Are you still a Twitter user, or has Mastodon claimed you?
I haven't yet made the switch over to Mastodon, but I've certainly probably reduced how much I'm on Twitter, but I am still on Twitter. That's probably still the best way of getting a hold of me. I also have a blog, which I can put in the show notes, so don't worry about writing stuff down now. But yeah, Twitter is probably the best place to get a hold of me right now. Still, I'm not yet on Mastodon. If Twitter goes downhill much more, I might switch over, but for now, I'm still on Twitter.
Cool, excellent. Well, what I'll do is I'll collect all of those links from you and make sure that they go into the show notes for sure. And like I said, Carl, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you today. Hopefully, we can do another one in person.
I would really love that. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
That'd be great.
Excellent. Well, like I said, thank you ever so much.
Okay, thanks, Jamie, and speak to you soon.
That was my interview with Carl Sargunar. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/review for ways to do that, or reach out via our contact page at .netcore.show/contact. And as always, remember to come back next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core Podcast is a production of RJJ Software.